Howdy, folks. This is the Keychains podcast. I'm Steve.
And I'm Ryan.
So, you are the only one who got to play last week.
I know. It was glorious.
That's not necessarily true. I did play, but not with you.
That's true. You were missed. You were.
So, how did it
You were
go?
asked about it. It was pretty good. There were, I think we only got, I think it was only 3 of us. That's right. But we do know of a total of 6 people that have at one point in time shown up to our Tuesday nights and played. One of them is you.
That's fair.
So it was pretty good though. It was fun. We played a whole bunch of stuff. I was able to. So I have a deck named Diesel, Guildmaster of the Covetous Tunnel, and it has library access and reverse time and phase shift and arise in it. So I almost got to do the like master combo of using library access and then reverse time to flip my my deck into my discard pile, and then use phase shift to play a rise and get all of my logos creatures out and play those into library access. I was the phase shift away, but I at least got the library access into reverse time, and then I was able to draw library access off of that and play it again. So I was able to draw 2 cards per card. That was pretty sweet. Although I only was able to trigger that one time, and then I ran out of steam.
Does that deck have like a key cheat in it?
A what? A key cheat? It has the worst possible key cheat. It has the darkness one.
Oh, the Key of Darkness?
Yeah, the one I've never, ever been in a situation where I could have used.
It's interesting with that deck, too, that you haven't pulled that off, given how much amber, like just through playing all of your cards, how much amber control it gives you.
You know, I should say I've been in situations where I could have used it, but I've never both had it available to me and had the ember to use it. That's the problem, because you need 12. The odds of your opponent being at exactly 0 ember are really, really hard. Like, I've kept notice because I just have this like vendetta against this card's existence now, because I've never been able to pull it off. And so I've just been looking, like, when does my opponent ever have 0 ember? And it is a very, very small amount of time where they have 0 ember. And so not only do they need to have 0 ember, you have to have 8 or more ember for you to do the cheap Key of Darkness. We should probably describe what it does at this point. Okay, so Key of Darkness is a Shadows card. When you play it, you forge a key at +6 current cost. If your opponent has no ember, forge a key at +2 current cost instead. So the vast majority of the time, you can cheat a key for 12 ember. And if your opponent, in the rare situation that your opponent has exactly 0 ember, you can cheat a key out for 8, which, you know, that one's not bad, but it's just so rare for your opponent to be at 0 when you're at 8. Most of the time what I find happens is I get this card and I have the ember, but then I'm just going to forge a key on my next turn anyway, so why would I pay 12 when I could just forge 2 keys across 2 turns? It depends on the situation that my opponent has going on, but most of the time I'd rather just not spend the 6. And I very rarely am in a situation where I have 2 keys and 12 ember to be able to cheat that 3rd key with this card. It's just, out of all of the key cheating cards, this is by far and away the worst one.
Yeah, it really requires the perfect storm of amber being on the table.
Right.
I have a couple of decks with it in it, and I've never seen a situation where I can control enough amber to pull it off. Even at like 12, like you said, like it's just really hard card to pull off.
Right. And most of the time, so the only time, in my mind anyway, that it makes strategic sense to use a Key of Darkness when you've got 12 ember is if it's your 3rd key, or if you're really worried about an opponent bait and switch, or an opponent too much to protect, any of those cards where you steal ember, or they will steal your ember. So if you somehow, maybe you had 6 to 8 ember and they miasmaed you, so you didn't get to forge your key, so now you've got 8 plus ember, and then you generate a little bit more, you get yourself up to 12. At that point, it's worth doing the Key of Darkness for 12, because now they can't steal any of that ember and you get your key, even if it's not your 3rd key. But I haven't been in a situation where, so the problem is you need to have all of that stuff working for you, and you need to have Key of Darkness. Most of the time it's so hard to set that situation up that I just discard Key of Darkness, or it's one of the first cards I archive because I can just take it back later down the road when I see that situation coming. But I hate having it in my hand because 99% of the game it will be useless. Um,
Yeah, I think the big thing with it is too is a lot of houses do have key cheating. But if you look at like Untamed, where Untamed doesn't have a lot of ways to control Amber, but it has a lot of ways to generate Amber, having a common key cheat in that house is good because it helps facilitate you that house moving fast.
right.
Where Shadows has a lot of ways to steal and control Amber, so giving them a key cheat that doesn't have a significantly high cost to it, like the good thing about Key of Darkness is it rewards a player for playing Shadows to the way Shadows would want to play. Like if you can too much protect or bait and switch and then steal a bunch to get that cost down so you can forge at 8, you can you can get that. But I feel like a lot of decks, and I'm sure there are decks out there that can pull it off, but I feel like a lot of decks just aren't equipped to capitalize on that.
Right. And I don't know. I just don't like it.
Yeah, no, it's intentionally rare. Like it's intentionally rare in that house because if it
Yeah, but
was
it's also intentionally bad. I don't know. It's just a bad card.
no, it's not intentionally bad. I think well yeah, I think it is intentionally bad.
No, I don't think it. I don't think it's intentionally bad. I think obviously they made it intentionally inefficient because they don't want people just stealing keys. But like you look at this and then you look at the Untamed one. What's the Untamed
Key
one?
charge.
Key charge. So key charge is an action just like this one, and it lets you forge at +1. Basically, you lose an ember and then you forge at the current cost. So you need 7 ember to forge a key, and that is amazing. That blows this one out of the water. And like you said, Untamed doesn't have a lot of ways to steal ember, but it has a ton of ways to generate ember. And not only that, it's not like it's going to be a house in a vacuum. It could be with a shadows deck, and so that the argument of, oh well, Untamed can't do a lot of ember generation, well, it doesn't really matter. It should. I think that key charge is definitely it's pushed. It's more powerful than it should be. It's way too efficient, especially looking at something like Key of Darkness. Like Key of Darkness is just utter crap. um it's way too situational. I get the forge a key at +2 current cost is fair. The +6 is ridiculous.
Yeah, I look at it this way. Like there's another card in Shadows that is also printed at rare called Finishing Blow, and it's an action. When you play it, it's destroy a damaged creature if you do steal one. And if you look at the rest of the kind of creature control that Shadows gives you, a lot of it is either through direct damage or it is bouncing. So like cards like Lights Out and Pawn Sacrifice, where even the ones that do damage, there's a significant downside to them. Where so what I what I've seen with rarity in this game, and a lot of it's been substantiated in a couple of other like conversations, but rarity doesn't necessarily mean good. It just means it's giving you access to something that that house technically shouldn't have, but would have a harder time. No, we'll say it's a mechanic outside of the house, right?
Or it's something like, I understand that there's a lot of ember stealing, ember control in shadows, and I get that cheating a key is dangerous in shadow. I get all of that, but this is, they went over the line in terms of making it playing it safe. I think with Key of Darkness, I don't know. Maybe I'm completely wrong and I'm totally missing something. But I have Key of Darkness in, I think, literally every Shadows deck I own, which is, I don't know, like 4 or 5 at this point. And I have never. I know
That's really
it's so
strange.
it's like it spites me. It's like I think the first 2 decks I got, one of them had it, and I'm like, oh, this card is crap. And then every deck after that is giving me one because they're like, you will love it.
I was thinking that with key abduction as well. Like I was like, I don't like this card, but I keep getting it.
So I don't know. I am not on the Key of Darkness bandwagon. Not that anyone is necessarily. I don't know how. people feel about it. Maybe we'll have to throw something up on Twitter asking, "Hey,
I,
what are your thoughts on Key of Darkness?"
I think some people have come out saying that they don't like Key of Darkness. I think it's pretty. I think it's universally
Yeah,
unwelcomed.
like I would rather not. I would rather not have like I would place Key of Darkness with anything, any other Shadows card, you name it. I would rather have it over Key of Darkness.
And that's pretty fair. So, kind of just to shift gears here a little bit, Fantasy Flight posted some art on their Instagram page, which is very interesting. I'm assuming that this is a preview to a card coming in the future. What do you
Um,
think?
so it could be a couple things. It could be it could be art for a future set. Um, it could be art for some kind of promotional material. It could be like a playmat. It could be like a chains card. It could be uh, I don't know. Could be anything along those lines. I mean, if we look at some of the hashtags that they use for the card, it's Keyforge, obviously, Dis, House Dis, uh, Archon, Heart of the Crucible. Yeah, I skipped a few that are irrelevant. So what's weird about this is that it's the hashtags are Dis and House Dis, and the background is very, very Dis. It's all that purple pink um, motif, black motif, and the character that's depicted in the center of the art, the almost the focal point, is 100% Sanctum, like no questions about it. So you've got this 100% Dis background, 100% Sanctum character, but the only hashtags are Dis. So it makes me feel like if this is a card, it's a Dis card. But like, what is going on that there would be like a Sanctum character so predominantly displayed in the center of it? I almost feel like this would have to be maybe an action, and maybe it's going to be corrupting him or something. I'm not sure.
I don't know. It's interesting. So I don't know. Like the comment that Fantasy Flight left with the image says, "Greetings, I bring bad tidings." So who knows? Like I'm excited to hear
Yeah,
whatever this is going to be. It's kind of weird to speculate on it because like no one really knows what it's going to be. They usually do use card art as like a lot of the other like they're definitely great at, recycling art through other things. So yeah, if this was a playmat, I'd probably buy it. It looks awesome.
I don't think they would ever do custom art just for a playmat. They would totally do art that was going to be on a card and then use that on a playmat. That's just a waste to pay for art and then only put it on a playmat that some people are going to
Yeah.
see. I mean, just from a business perspective, it doesn't make any sense to use something other than card art.
So we kind of originally pitched ourselves as like casual players who have a competitive streak. Like it's in our description. It's all over the place, and that's not changing. But we did realize something that I think we'd like to kind of focus on today, and a lot of it is this idea of like you're listening to us and you have friends that you want to get into this game. So what we wanted to do is kind of put together uh, something to help your friends understand the game with, when you're giving them that elevator pitch, like, hey, this is this cool game that I've been playing. If you want to learn more about it, you can come listen to this or whatever. So we're gonna do like a back to basics episode where we kind of explain some things about the game and how to play it, and then clarify some things that you might run into in the future that you don't really know, like or just something that you might be confusing, or a question that you might enter into. So we want to make sure that we explain the game at a high level for people, but also clarify some gotcha moments that you might see while you're playing the game.
Right, because there's a lot whenever you're learning any game for the first time. There's a lot that you learn like right up front. You remember the basics. You remember how things go. We want to point out some of the little, like Steve said, the gotchas, the things that you're not going to remember your first time through, and then your second time through you maybe have completely forgotten about them, and now you're playing wrong. So we want to call attention to some of those, or maybe even if you've played a few games, these might come in handy as little bits that you might already be doing wrong or might not have been aware of.
Yeah, so it could be a situation like, again, there's hopefully something for everybody in this episode. We want to try to, and maybe, and if we miss something and you catch it and you want to like mention it to us, please do. Like, we'll make this like a back and forth kind of dialogue if need be.
Yep.
But hopefully, what we can do is we can get in front of a lot of the issues that you could run into in a game to make your learning this game a little bit easier.
And what this isn't going to do is it's not going to literally teach you how to play. We're not going to go line by line through the rule book. We're not going to teach you every in and out of the rules. Definitely go read the rule book, find someone that can teach you how to play, or watch videos. There's a bunch of videos on YouTube where people show you how to play the game. Just listening to people describe how to play a game is not going to do it for you, unless I don't know, maybe some people can learn that way. I definitely cannot. I need to actually have the cards in my hand to learn how to play it. But we will at least go over the basics, almost like an elevator pitch of how the game works, as a breakdown, so that you're at least familiar with how the game works.
Yeah, and even having said that, like, even if you get taught by a friend on how to play, the rule books are free on the website. If you just scroll to the bottom of the website, the keyforgegame.com, and then go to the very, very bottom, there's a section there that just says rules. If you click on it, it gives you the quick start rules, which I would just ignore those, don't bother. uh, the actual rules, and then it gives you all the tournament information. So if you do decide that this is a game you really like to play and you want to get involved in the tournament scene at your local game store, you have access to all those right there. So that way you won't show up and be like, I didn't know this. Having said that, what is Keyforge? And the answer to that question is Keyforge is a collectible card game where the decks are all pre-made for you using a specialized algorithm to generate the decks. So they are not random. That's one thing that kind of gets misconstrued a lot, is the decks are randomly generated. No, they actually have an algorithm they're going through and changing over time. Like, I've even learned recently that they're changing the algorithm in between printings. So over time you're going to see uh how the decks are being constructed being changed up over time, which is super cool. But there is logic behind it. It's not just a random mess of cards that are just getting thrown into a pack, and you're gonna end up with something completely unplayable with every deck that you purchase. That's not how it works. You're going to definitely have decks that are less efficient, or you just might not understand how the deck was constructed and why what its playstyle is. But ultimately, the decks are there's intelligence behind how the decks are being constructed.
Right. You're never going to have a deck that has 0 creatures.
I've had decks with houses that have close to 0 creatures, though.
I think there's a minimum, but yeah.
There is a minimum. So with that being said, each deck has split between 3 houses. We won't go into all the names of the houses. It'll be fairly obvious what those are, as you're kind of going through.
Houses are kind of like factions, if you want to think of it that way. They're just different. If you're familiar with other card games like Magic, they're like the different colors. Or if you, I don't know, I can't think of any other card games. But yeah,
Fair.
houses are basically factions.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, like, you could even use Netrunner if you want to stick to Fantasy Flight stuff. Like Netrunner, like the decks have factions in those too. So
That's true.
so it's similar to that. So your deck is going to have 36 cards in it, 12 per house. And the objective of the game to win the objective of the game is to generate enough of a resource called Amber to forge 3 keys. Once you do that and you end your turn, or actually at the moment you forge the 3rd key, you win.
Yep. You need, in order to forge a single key, you need 6 Ember. I pronounce it Ember. It's spelled AEMBER, and some people pronounce it Amber. Some people pronounce it Ember. It's the same thing.
I'm in house Amber.
I'm definitely Ember.
I mean, if you think about how ether or aether is pronounced, it could be Amber.
Amber.
I don't, you know what? I don't like this. I'm just sticking with Amber.
Yeah, I think you pick a side and stick to your side, and never the twain shall meet. So, regardless, you need 6 Ember in order to forge a single key. You can only forge 1 key on each of your turns. sort of. As we talked about at the top of this episode, there are methods by which you can forge keys outside of the forge key step, and we'll go over the steps in a turn later on. But there are ways to generate more than one key per turn. It's just that by the rules, you can only do one default key per turn. And you need 6 Ember to do it. So over the course of the entire game, you'll need 18 Ember.
And that can change too. There are certainly cards that adjust the cost of a key over throughout the game, so it's not a hard fast rule. One of the things you will learn quickly about this game is, obviously, if you played any other card games, the cards will often contradict the rule book, in which the card will always be the de facto rule over the rule book. So with that, there are 4 card types in the game. There are creatures, actions, and artifacts, and upgrades. Well, I guess we'll start with creatures, because they're going to be the primary card that you play on a turn. And creatures are used.
They're kind of the workhorse of winning the game for the most part in most decks.
Right. So creatures have 2 abilities that they can use. They're not, and we're going to have to use, as a preface, we're going to use ability interchangeably here a little bit. So you can exhaust creatures, which is turning them sideways, to either fight an enemy creature, or reap, which is generating 1 amber, which you'll take from the pile, you'll put it in your amber pile. And then with that, creatures may have some bolded text on there that'll say fight or reap. Fight abilities resolve when the creature fights another enemy creature and survives at the end. And then once that has resolved, the creature's ability will trigger. Usually it'll be like steal 1 amber, or purge 1 creature from something. That doesn't necessarily matter, but effectively, it's good to know that if a creature fights, it has to survive at the end of fighting to have that fight ability trigger.
So they can still fight even if they don't have the bolded text fight, and they can reap even if they don't have the bolded text reap. It's just that when they fight, when they reap, if they have that bolded text, there's an added benefit, right?
Right, correct. So with reaping, there's probably not a situation where this ever will happen, but with reaping, the creature does need to survive at the end of reaping in order for the reap ability to trigger. I don't actually think there's an instance where that would happen. I can't think of one off the top of my head.
We're future proofing. Maybe like a year from now there'll be more sets, and someone will come back and listen to this episode, and we won't sound like idiots for painting ourselves into a rule corner.
Right.
We'll sound like idiots for other reasons.
Yeah. So there is another thing that you might run into on some creatures it'll be a bolded text that says action. You can take an action by exhausting the creature and then resolving the action. Now that means it does not fight and it does not reap when it takes an action. This is where we're going to use a term interchangeably from something else. But actions, you resolve that thing. So there's 1 creature that when you exhaust it, it steals 1 amber, or when you exhaust it as the action, it steals 1 amber. It doesn't do anything else outside of that.
When we say exhaust, by the way, that's an in-game mechanic. Whenever you exhaust anything, that just means rotate it 90 degrees, so that instead of it being kind of vertically positioned from your perspective, the way you would normally look at the card, it's turned 90 degrees sideways.
Right. So then one other small thing about creatures that a lot of people run into is if a creature has a multiple of the same keyworded ability, it resolves all of those keyworded abilities. So if you have a creature that has 2 fight triggers, both fight triggers resolve. If a creature has 2 reap abilities or reap triggers, both reap triggers resolve. And then the same thing with actions. If it has multiple actions, when you take the action, it resolves all actions on that creature. So it's something worth knowing. Like if you're going to play a card on a creature and it's like, oh, well, I don't want to override this action ability that this creature already has. It doesn't do that. It just resolves them all, which can make for some very fun shenanigans. We're going to kind of tail into another card type while we're still talking about creatures here, and that's upgrades. So what upgrades do is when you play the upgrade, you target a creature with the upgrade, and then you slot that card behind that creature. Now that creature has whatever the upgrade says. Usually it'll be a new keyword, or it'll be some sort of kind of passive effect that applies to the creature. I know there's a Sanctum card that gives it +1 armor and taunt, which we won't talk about what taunt is. It's not relevant to what we're kind of getting into, but just know that there are a lot of things that you can modify your creatures with through upgrades.
Mhm.
And then the one last thing I wanted to talk about with creatures is steal versus capture. So a lot of creatures are going to have abilities that steal, and a lot of creatures are going to have abilities that capture amber. Ultimately, what the difference between those two mean is that if you steal an amber from an opponent, it goes to your amber pool. So if that, in doing so, if you have 5 amber, you steal 1, you're now at 6, and you will announce check to your opponent at the end of your turn because you can forge a key at the end. Where capturing changes things is if you capture an amber, it gets placed on that creature. And then when that creature is removed from the table, the amber goes to the opponent. So why I'm clarifying that is if you most of the time you're always going to capture on your own creatures, but capturing always comes from your opponent's amber pool. So there are certain cards in the game that will capture amber from their amber pool onto their own creatures. So if you remove those creatures from the game, that amber comes to you, not them. So that's one of the things that you want to keep in mind is that capturing amber is always going to go to the opponent when the creature is removed.
That brings us to actions, artifacts, and mentioned it briefly before, but also upgrades. These are cards that just kind of make things more interesting. Artifacts are cards that come into play, they stay in play unless something gets rid of them. They have actions, and some of them may have passive effects. So, an action might be something that lets you exhaust the artifact to fight with one of your creatures that you've already fought with. Passive effect might be that all keys your opponents try to forge cost an extra ember, stuff like that. Upgrades get slapped onto creatures, like we talked about. They make things a little more interesting. Maybe it makes a creature do a little extra damage. Maybe it gives it taunt. Makes things more interesting for those. Actions are one and done cards. You play the action, it goes to your discard pile, and you resolve the ability. Actions can do all sorts of stuff from destroying creatures to destroying artifacts to giving you ember for no reason whatsoever to letting you forge a key outside of the normal key forging phase. When it comes to any of these cards, you resolve as much of the card as possible. So let's say you get a card that says deal 3 damage to 2 creatures, and there's only 1 creature on the table. Well, you just deal 3 damage to that 1 creature and you skip the rest of it. Let's say there's a creature under your opponent's control and a creature under your control. Well, you deal 3 damage to 2 creatures and there's 2 creatures. Sucks to be you. Maybe you should have thought a little bit more about how you wanted to play that card. But one or the other, if you can't complete the entire card, you still do as much of it as you can. Another thing to note, everything comes into play exhausted. If you've played other card games, that's one thing that can kind of trip you up a little bit. I know it does for me all the time. Coming from a Magic background, in Magic, the creatures do not come into play the equivalent of exhausted. You have to use them first. And in Keyforge, it's tricky because I keep playing a creature and forgetting that I have to turn it sideways to show that it comes in exhausted. And it's very, very relevant. A lot of new players, I feel bad picking on them and like, hey, you got to exhaust that. Hey, you got to exhaust that. Hey, you got to exhaust that. But it is really, really relevant. Not only because it kind of lets your opponent know what's going to be coming at them, but it also there are cards that affect like what you can attack with and everything else. So if you play a creature and you don't exhaust it, and then you play something else that lets you, I don't know, buff your creature, give it extra damage or something, you might be tempted to fight with that creature, even though you can't because it should have come in exhausted. So always remember to exhaust your stuff when it comes into play. And that goes for creatures and artifacts. Upgrades don't come in exhausted because they go on the creature. Actions don't come into play, so they can't come in exhausted.
Oh, one thing I wanted to actually also kind of attach to what you're saying when we were talking about resolving as much of the card as you can. Uh, Keyforge has a lot of what you would call symmetrical effects in it. Very rarely do you encounter situations where it's only going to affect your opponent. I mean, not to say that it doesn't exist. It's just that it's probably good to get into your mind that if something affects your opponent, it's going to say your opponent on the card. If it says something like, and this is something I ran into when we first started playing the game, because I had a card called Titan Mechanic. It's a 6 power creature. Keys cost 1 less to forge. And in reading that, I was like, oh, that means keys cost me 5 instead of 6. And it's like, well, yes, it does, but it also means that for my opponent as well. Where you'll see the difference there is cards like Murmuk, which is a 3 power creature that comes into play under. This is an Untamed House card, by the way, and that one says your opponent's keys cost +1 to forge. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about how you're playing your cards, is how symmetrical effects are going to affect you versus your opponent. And another thing to think about too, when it comes into resolving as much of a card as possible, is when you're playing a card, look for the term may. Make sure when you play that card, it says may. Because there's one card out there, I can't remember which one it is now. It's a Brobnar card that when it comes into play, it stuns a creature. And it just says play, stun a creature. So if you play that card, he has to stun himself. Bumpsy. I think, is it Bumpsy?
It might be.
Like, now I'm trying to remember because
there's a Sanctum card that does a similar thing too. So
yeah. So Lady Maxina, that's a good example. Lady Maxina, when she comes into play, she stuns a creature. If she does not have a creature to stun, she stuns herself.
Yep.
So just Smash. That's who it is. It's not Bumpsy. It's Smash. If you play that creature, they stun themselves. But there are other things like the Lost in the Woods. It says you may return up to 2 friendly creatures, and then you remove 2 enemy creatures. So you can kind of play around with that as well. So it's just something to keep in mind about how symmetrical effects and how resolve as much of you can kind of works in tandem with the game rules. One other thing to kind of keep in mind is when it is not your turn, you are effectively the spectator. There is no interaction in this game like if you've played Magic before, where you can do things at instant speed during your opponent's turn, things like that. That doesn't exist here.
Same with Hearthstone. There's no traps. There's nothing that you can kind of put in play that's going to pop out and get your opponent on their turn. It's very much you do your thing, then they do their thing, which I don't know. The way I say that makes it sound boring, but it's actually really refreshing.
It is the thing that the reason why it's actually a good thing is because you don't have to worry about what you're holding up. You don't have to, or your decision making for what you're holding up is different. So it's like, well, how you're mostly focusing on how do I set myself up for my next turn based on how my opponent is playing right now, as opposed to, well, I need to hold up this counter spell so I can counter whatever big play that they're going to drop on the table here. So that's just something to keep in mind. But having said that, this is something that I don't feel is very clear in the rule book. But I wanted to kind of call attention to it here in the terms of you being kind of the spectator on your opponent's turn, is that all decisions for all cards are made by the active player. And we're not going to get into the ruling on this, especially seeing as they've errated it, and don't worry about this part necessarily, but any card that says may at the time of it being played is up to the decision of the active player. So just keep that in mind. There's probably not going to be a whole lot of situations where you're going to run into this, but just know if the card says may, the active player always chooses what's going to happen.
All right, so we've gone over a lot of the different things, the ins and outs of what the cards are and all that stuff. So how does this all come together into playing the game and taking your turn? The turn is 5 phases long. It starts off with forging a key. At the very beginning of any player's turn, the game, finger quotes here, the game looks at how much ember is in their ember pool, and if they have 6 or more, then it tries to forge a key. That's obviously altered by maybe if there's a card that increases the cost of a key, lowers the cost of a key, or someone could flat out play a card that says you can't forge a key on your forge step. Obviously, that impacts this. But assuming that there's nothing like that in play, you forge a key if you have 6 ember. It is mandatory. You cannot skip it. You cannot forget it. If you did forget it, you forge that key, take away that ember, and hopefully it hasn't been that long through the game that you forgot whether or not you forged your key when you were supposed to. So you don't get those feel bads of like, oh, I forgot to forge my key. Oh, well, now it's too late. I guess you lose. because I'm ahead of you. It's whatever, but you know what I mean. Um,
Right.
After forging a key, you choose the house that you'd like to play. In this game, you, as we mentioned before in the deck construction part, there's 3 houses per deck. You can only use 1 house per turn. So if you have a deck that has Sanctum, Logos, and Shadows, you can choose one of those 3 to use during your turn. Now, when I say use during your turn, what I mean is you play cards, discard cards, and use cards in play only from that house. So if you choose Logos, you can only use Logos creatures. You can only activate Logos artifacts. You can only play Logos actions and upgrades and play further creatures and artifacts that are Logos. And if there are cards that are maybe dead in your hand and you want to get rid of them, we'll explain why in a moment. But if you want to get rid of those cards because they're not doing you any good and you'd rather have something else, you can only discard Logos cards. So it's a very, very strategic, tactical decision as far as what house you want to activate. Um, after you're done playing all of the cards you want to play, after you're done using all of your cards to fight, reap, do whatever, then you ready everything. As we mentioned, everything comes into play exhausted. And when you use something, like if you use a creature to fight, if you use a creature to reap, then that creature becomes exhausted as part of that process. The 4th step of the game, after you're done playing everything, like I said, is readying all of those creatures. So at the end of the turn, they all get flipped back to vertical, back to that original position that you'd play a card in. After you're done readying everything, you draw back up to 6 cards. So if you have 0 cards in your hand, you draw 6. If you have 3 cards in your hand, left over at the end of your turn, you draw 3 more. That's where discarding is relevant because you may have a card that's not really worthwhile in your hand. You're not going to use it in the next few turns. Well, why have it clog up your hand? Just discard it, assuming it's part of the house that you declared, and then you can replace it at the end of the turn, which gives you the chance of getting something that is useful more quickly. The other interesting thing about drawing at the end of your turn is I think it gives a little bit more time to make your decisions. A lot of other card games will have you draw a card at the beginning of your turn, but that means that you have your opponent's entire turn where you're not sure if the plan that you're thinking of doing is going to change because you're going to see a new card come the start of your turn. And that can completely change what you want to do. Maybe it's the one card that can win you the game. And so you can't really strategize too well if you're drawing a card at the beginning of your turn. So I really like that they have you draw cards at the end of your turn because now you draw all of your cards, and since it's kind of a passive experience during your opponent's turn, you're not actively doing anything. You can be sitting there looking at your cards and know that you're not going to have a tremendous amount of new information to play with come your turn. You're not going to have a surprise popping up at you. Obviously, you still have to change your plans based on what your opponent is doing, but you can do that while they're playing, and you don't have this surprise card that's going to be popping up at the beginning of your turn to change how everything goes. I think it actually speeds up gameplay a lot in that regard.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Definitely.
One thing I didn't mention, some cards will have the give you the ability to archive a card, which basically means you put it out of play into an archive pile. The time that you can fetch the cards from your archive pile is after you choose your house for the turn. So you forge a key if relevant, you choose your house, and then you decide whether or not to take your archives into your hand. If you choose to do so, you take all of the cards in your archive. You can't pick and choose. If you choose not to take any cards from your archive, they just stay out of play, and you get that decision again the following turn. You get to decide every turn, as long as you have cards in your archive, whether or not you want to take any into your hand, which can be very, very useful. I traditionally put board wipes into my archive because I want to wait until my opponent has a whole bunch of creatures. Then I want to pull that card out of my archive and take out all of their creatures. But in the meantime, it's not taking up a spot in my hand. It's not one of my 6 cards. Very, very useful.
And another thing I want to kind of add on to there too is with the on your third step with the play, draw, play, discard, or use cards. I just want to clarify that there is no particular order in which you do things. This isn't like
Right.
again, I will use Magic as the kind of comparison here because it's where most people get this knowledge from. Is like Magic has there's the combat pre-combat announced attackers announced defenders combat or damage and then end combat. That doesn't happen here. You can, and the reason why I bring this up is because there's a strategic element to how you fight or do certain things during your turn. There is cards that will reward you for fighting first. So you want to play that card, do all your fighting, do all your reaping, and then discard any cards you want. Or you can, fight, play this action, reap with a creature, play another action, fight with another creature. Like, you're not beholden to sticking to certain actions,
Right.
doing certain actions before others. Like, you do them whenever you want.
Yeah, I mean, maybe there's a creature that lets you shuffle your discard pile and your deck back together, so you might want to discard at the start of your turn so that those cards go back into your deck and you have a chance of drawing them again later on.
Right. Or play them
Yeah.
beforehand.
Yeah, that's true too. But that I mentioned our earlier example of maybe you have a card that deals 3 damage to 2 creatures. You might play that to deal 3 damage to one of their creatures while you have no creatures out. Then after it's resolved, you play your creature. And that way, haha, I had a creature the whole time, but I didn't have to hit my own creature because I didn't play it until after.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that kind of sums up a good majority of what we were.
Yeah, for better or for worse, yeah.
Yeah. I hope the new players got something out of it. I hope, veterans got something, I hope.
If nothing else,
so
at least a laugh.
Yeah. or a reason to correct us. So as we're kind of closing out here, I wanted to actually give a shout out to the Meek Informant podcast. They are a L5R, and for those who are not in the know, that's Legend of the Five Rings, another Fantasy Flight game that has come out. So if you play Keyforge, or not Keyforge, if you play L5R or you're interested in getting involved in L5R, I'd highly give them a listen. You can find them over at themeekinformant.podbean.com, or if you just search for the Meek Informant in any of your any podcasting app that you're using, you can certainly find them there. So yeah, so that they're super cool. And then other than that, Ryan, have you? So I found, I'm gonna totally fess to this. I found these through a follower on our Twitter account. It's the Strategic Dino tokens.
Yep, it's on Etsy. Their Etsy store is etsy.com/shop/strategic dino. DINO.
I think if you search,
or you can just search for.
I think if you just type in strategicdino.com, I think it resolves to his Etsy shop.
Yeah.
But if you're in the market for tokens, dude, this guy has knocked it out of the park. Specifically with his keys, like he has UV printed clear acrylic keys.
They're pretty sweet.
And yeah, they're so good. They're so good. Did you see the new Amber tokens that he posted up?
Yeah, they look really cool.
It's awesome. So if you're in the market for tokens, I know we had a whole episode about tokens, or not a whole episode, but we did significantly discuss tokens. But if you're in the market, definitely check out Strategic Dino. He makes good stuff for what it looks like a lot of Fantasy Flight games. But
yeah,
you're playing Keyforge, you want to get the sweet Keyforge tokens.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I think we're good. You have anything else you want to mention there, Ryan?
No. I don't think so. No, I got nothing.
All right. Well, you can find us at obviously Keyforge, keychainspod.podbean.com, or you can send us an email at keychainspod@gmail.com, or find us over on Twitter or Facebook at keychainspod, or at keychainspod. Yeah. God, I'm so bad at this.
Also, if you check us out on Twitter, check out the people we're following. There's a lot of other content creators out there. You can give them a listen too. And a quick way to find them is just through our Twitter. I've been trying to make it a point to follow any content creators that I come across.
Sweet. All right. Well, have a great one, everybody.
Yeah, take care, guys.